All right, hi, and welcome to the Johnny Random Show. I am here with my beautiful wife, and we're going to react to some things. We are doing some funny things and some serious things. We just did a funny one. Hope you subscribe to the channel and go watch all of our content on the Johnny Random Show. This is going to be a little bit more serious. I've seen this video before, but Jasmine has not. So this is more of a reaction from her for her. And then yeah, so let's get into it. You have anything?
Let's do it.
You excited? All right, good.
Slavery. Nowhere have intellectuals seen racial issues as issues about intertemporal abstractions more so than in discussions of slavery. Moreover, few facts of history have been so distorted by highly selective filtering as has the history of slavery. To many people today, slavery means white people holding black people in bondage. The vast millions of people around the world who were neither white nor black, but who were either slaves or enslavers for centuries, fade out of this vision of slavery as if they had never existed, even though they may well have outnumbered both blacks and whites. It has been estimated that there were more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. China, during the era of slavery, has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Slaves were a majority of the population in some of the cities in Southeast Asia. At some period or other in history, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, almost every people now civilized have consisted, in majority, of slaves. When Abraham Lincoln said,
Did you know that?
No.
Like, there hasn't ever been a civilization up until, what, like the 1800s that didn't have slaves in it.
No, that.
if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, he was expressing an idea peculiar to Western civilization at that time, and by no means universally accepted throughout Western civilization. What seems almost incomprehensible today is that there was no serious challenge to the moral legitimacy of slavery prior to the 18th century. Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia both had slaves. Even Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slaves. Although intellectuals today may condemn slavery as a historic evil of our society, what was peculiar about Western society was not that it had slaves, like other societies around the world, but that it was the first civilization to turn against slavery, and that it spent more than a century destroying slavery, not only within Western civilization itself, but also in other countries around.
That's something they definitely don't really teach at school.
Yeah.
You know, that like every civilization in the history of humanity had slaves, basically, until America. We were always sort of taught that, like, America, all the founding fathers had slaves, so that makes, them racist, But, obviously you had a lot of founding fathers.
So, like, kind of
That,
piggybacking off of the other countries.
I mean, it was just like what you're born into,
Yeah.
know? But then, like, even the northern states, they didn't have slavery, and they didn't want slavery, but in the South, they did. And so it was kind of one of
Do you
those
know
things where it
why?
was just too
Why did the South
hard.
want slaves and not the North?
Why they wanted slaves?
Yeah.
Um, because it's cheaper labor. I mean, why does anybody want slaves? Cheap labor. If it's something that's a part of, I mean, it doesn't seem wrong to you. And one thing that this video is pointing out is it's not usually, and through history, it's not usually whites owning blacks or blacks owning whites or Asian owning blacks or whatever kind of race. It's you're enslaving poor people in your own culture. So rich people enslaving white people that are also white, to do jobs and things like that. So black people that have power in Africa enslaving other African tribes that they conquered, and
I didn't know white people got enslaved. I thought they only got enslaved like if they were indebted to someone. I didn't know they didn't. I never thought that they just took white people and made them as slaves just because. Like, I never heard of that. I know white people were slaves because they owed someone something, and that's how they worked to pay their debt. But black people didn't have to work to pay their debt; they just had to work for free.
No, that every civilization has like different versions of it, right? So, like the way that in one culture you might be able to earn your freedom, but in other cultures you don't. Like your kids might be born free, but every culture has had sort of a different way to do it. You know, there's no one way to do slavery, but it's not always racist because they're doing it against their own race. Slavery is just an evil of itself, and it can be racist, obviously, when you're enslaving someone because they're inferior race, which is something that definitely happened in America and what makes America really, you know, maybe different than past countries, but all civilizations has had slavery. So.
World over the often bitter and sometimes armed resistance of people in other societies. Only the overwhelming military power of Western nations during the age of imperialism made this possible. Slavery did not quietly die out of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end in countries around the world, and it has still not totally died out to this day in parts of the Middle East and Africa. It is the image of racial slavery, white people enslaving black people, that has been indelibly burned into the consciousness of both black and white Americans today by the intelligentsia, and not simply as a fact about the past, but as a causal factor used to explain much of the present, and an enduring moral condemnation of the enslaving race. Yet two crucial facts have been filtered out of this picture. One, the institution of slavery was not based on race, and two, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. The very word slave is derived from the name of a European people, Slavs, who were enslaved for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. It was not only in English that the word for slave derived from the word for Slav. The same was true in various other European languages and in Arabic.
So basically, like the Slavic people, which is now known as like Russians, Ukrainians, all of these people, whatever, they were captured, I think, possibly by like Mongolian tribes and stuff, and sold around. So that's where the term slave came that we know of today. I mean, obviously they had slaves, but like the reason we use the word slave to talk about slavery is based on that, is what he's saying. So, from white people. So,
for most of the history of slavery, which covers most of the history of the human race, most slaves were not racially different from those who enslaved them. Not only did Europeans enslave Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, after it became both technologically and economically feasible to transport masses of slaves from one continent to another, that is, to have a whole population of slaves of a different race, Europeans as well as Africans were enslaved and transported from their native lands to bondage on another continent. Pirates alone transported 1 million Europeans as slaves to the Barbary coast of North Africa, at least twice as many European slaves as there were African slaves transported to the United States.
That's something else you don't hear about, and I meant to look that up before I got you on here, kind of like have a little bit more facts. But like, you only hear about slaves coming here from Africa. You don't hear about white slaves being traded back. You know, like because I think it just doesn't fit with like they're trying to tell a very simple story. You know, like black people and white people is bad. It's abolished now. Civil War, cool. Moving on, Jim Crow, blah 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 blah. Everybody out today. It doesn't fit so simply into be like So I think that's the only problem with school sometimes. I think is like we dumb it down to teach kids, but then you don't actually learn the full depths of it sometimes.
Yeah.
But I meant to look that up.
And to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, white slaves were still being bought and sold in the Islamic world decades after blacks had been freed in the United States. What marked the modern era of slavery in the West was the fact that, as distinguished historian Daniel Boorstin pointed out, now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with the difference of race. But to claim that race or racism was the basis of slavery is to cite as a cause something that happened thousands of years after its supposed effect. As for the legacy of slavery in the world of today, that is something well worth investigating, as distinguished from simply making sweeping assumptions. Too many assumptions that have been made about the effects of slavery on both blacks and whites will not stand up under scrutiny.
About to get an ad. But, I mean, slavery can be racism or racist motivated.
Back during the era of slavery in the United States,
Yeah.
such prominent writers as the French visitor and observer Alexis de Tocqueville, Northern traveler in the antebellum South, Frederick Law Olmsted, and prominent Southern writer Hinton Helper all pointed to striking differences between the North and the South, and attributed the deficiencies of the Southern region to the effects of slavery on the white population of the South. These differences between Northern and Southern whites were not merely perceptions or stereotypes, they were factually demonstrable in areas ranging from literacy rates to rates of unwed motherhood, as well as in attitudes toward work and violence. But attributing these differences to slavery ignored the fact that the ancestors of white Southerners differed in these same ways from the ancestors of white Northerners, when they both lived in different parts of Britain and when neither had ever seen a black slave. Does the moral enormity of slavery give it any more decisive causal weight in explaining the situation of blacks today than it did in explaining that of whites in the antebellum South? There is no a priori answer to that question, which must be examined empirically, like many other questions. The fact that so many black families today consist of women with fatherless children has been said by many to be a legacy of slavery. Yet most black children grew up in two-parent families, even under slavery itself, and for generations thereafter. As recently as 1960, 2/3 of black children were still living in two-parent families. A century ago, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were married than were whites.
Did you ever hear that?
No.
That, like, because of racism is why the African American population typically has more, like, single parents.
Yeah, I have heard that, but I didn't know that 2/3 of African American families had fathers.
Yeah, it wasn't racism. I mean, it wasn't slavery that tore families apart. That they're actually saying that even after, like, Jim Crow, there was more married white people. I mean, black families than there were white families. It wasn't really until they started doing welfare, where it's like you get more food stamps if the father's not in there. Yeah, they didn't do that till after decades and decades after. That's only been in the last.
But why would they make that
years.
law to do that? Like, what? Why would they?
Well,
do that?
It was coming from a good place. You want to help. You want to help parent. You know, you're trying to help people that don't have support. But then if a dad is like, I'm struggling, and you're better off without me,
yeah,
I'm gonna book it. You know what I mean? So actually, you can't even blame a lot of the men because it's like it's better for my family if I'm not in the picture. You'll get more support. You know, so. And then women, you can't blame them. Like, no, I'm not going to marry him because, you know, I'll lose my stuff. I feel like
it's a blessing and a curse at the same time.
It's an absolute curse because you're trading off an immediate satisfaction, right? Some immediate food stamp money or whatever, you know, kind of benefits for like a long-term, your family stability. I mean, there's countless statistics.
Yeah, like welfare is only helping you financially. Like
in the short term.
Parents help you financially, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. So
there's like so many statistics that married couples do so much better in the long term financially, and then that means their kids do better financially. I mean, there's a lot of data for that. But
in some years, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were in the labor force than were whites. The reasons for changes for the worse in these and other patterns must be sought in our own times. Whatever the reasons for the disintegration of the black family, it escalated to the current disastrous level well over a century after the end of slavery, though less than a generation after a large expansion of the welfare state and its accompanying non-judgmental ideology. To say that slavery will not bear the full weight of responsibility for all subsequent social problems among black Americans is not to say that it had negligible consequences among either blacks or whites, or that its consequences ended when slavery itself ended. But this is only to say that answers to questions about either slavery or race must be sought in facts, not in assumptions or visions, and certainly not in attempts to reduce questions of causation to only those which provide moral melodramas and an opportunity for the intelligentsia to be on the side of the angels. Just as Western Europeans in post-Roman times benefited from the fact that their ancestors had been conquered by the Romans, with all the brutality and oppression that entailed, blacks in America today have a far higher standard of living than most Africans in Africa as a result of their ancestors being enslaved, with all the injustices and abuses that entailed. There is no question that both...
What do you think of that? That's something I never thought about before.
That they're more successful because they were slaves than people that weren't?
No, they were brought to this country, right, against their will, and slaves. But then they're, the Civil War and everything, and then after that, you get to live and partake in a society which is far more advanced than African cultures today. You know what I mean?
That weren't slaves?
Yeah, that weren't slaves.
That was my point.
Yeah.
You're more successful as a slave than you weren't. That's what I said.
Yeah, but like years later, just because of where you were. I mean, like, kind of like something that bad happened to your ancestors that actually kind of helps people nowadays be able to get ahead,
I think it's believable.
But we did sort of, well, not we per se, but like the colonizers did sort of, get, like, use those countries for, like, manufacturing like certain like products and then shipping over here and kind of keeping them economically poor. Like that was a result of colonization, which was negative. But yeah,
enslavement were traumatic experiences for those on whom they were inflicted, nor is either morally justified by whatever benefits might come of this to subsequent generations of their offspring. But history cannot be undone, nor does conceiving of races as intertemporal abstractions have any such track record as to make it look like a promising approach to the present or the future.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there was some stuff that was talked about that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
But I can't believe all of it. I would have probably do my own research on it to know.
Yeah.
I discovered that
I actually had to do a lot of it too, because like I didn't really believe a lot of it. I'm like, the more I looked into it, the more I'm like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Like, interesting to like think about that there's a lot more that we don't think about from that perspective, And then, do you know where the term cracker came from?
No.
I always thought that it was from like the slave masters cracking the whip, but it's actually a term that came from England, where there was a group of people and they were like always cracking jokes, and they were violent, just like loud, bragging all the time, getting into fights, getting rough, like getting their necks red because they're fighting. Whatever, white people get like red marks, whatever. So they're rednecks and crackers. And they drunk all the time, fighting all the time. And when they came over to the Americas, they mostly inhabited the South. So a lot of those people became slave owners or were just poor white people that had this sort of like ghetto white people culture. Yeah. And African, obviously, culture in the South and like kind of blurred together a little bit. So it's weird that like these European crackers and rednecks culture influenced because, and one thing that he kind of casually mentioned that we went into a little bit further, because there's a part 2 on this about how Northerners looked at Southerners as just backwards, poor, always fighting, always drunk, can't get a job, like look down on them, like they'd rather hire an African American to do a job than these rednecks, like, and so like Southern culture like came through some really weird evolutions here that you don't think about, but yeah. So Anyway, any last thoughts? We'll wrap this up. All right. Well, thank you.
I'm glad I got to do it.
Yeah, it's a little different. That was a little heavy. We'll do some more funny stuff, I promise. So watch our other funny stuff. Subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time.
Bye.